Okay. So, so what I'd like to talk to you about today is some of the research that I'm doing related to international nuclear safeguards at Sandia. This is an area that my colleague Tim Shutt and I have been working on for the past 2 years or so, but a lot of things have kind of been building up to that specific work. So again, apologies for the misnomer on the slides. I know you guys are not University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Let's see, how do I click in? There we go. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about today is 3 main things. So first, I'd like to give you kind of just an introduction to international safeguards in general, in case that's an area that you're not super familiar with. I'll go brief in case all of you are already experts, which Phoenix alluded that you might be. And then talk about why does computer vision matter within this space? Why is this research important at all? Then we'll get into the hard part. So what are some of the challenges that are really specific to safeguards, as well as some other non-proliferation applications that make computer vision both really attractive and also really hard to do. And then finally, we'll talk about this kind of like leading you up to the pitch here for the research that we're doing at Sandia, which is about synthetic data and how that might be used to support some of these challenges. And also talk about our really cool data validation process that we're working on now. And then since all of you are students and always looking for cool topics for, I don't know, a master's thesis or dissertation project, I'll give you some free research ideas that you can feel free to take that can utilize this data. So first, international safeguards and computer vision. There we go. Now you can see the whole thing. Okay, so international nuclear safeguards, or sometimes I'll just say safeguards, but I always mean international nuclear safeguards, are a series of measures that are applied by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is an organization that operates under the auspices of the United Nations through bilateral and multilateral agreements. So states have sovereign rights here, really in an attempt to do 3 things. So the first is to verify that nuclear material in a known facility isn't being diverted off, skimmed off the top to make a nuclear weapons program someplace else. Second, that nuclear facilities that we know about aren't being misused. So when I say misused, I mean things like we have a little side process, a night shift that's not being talked about to to produce undeclared material. And then finally, to verify that no undeclared nuclear activities are happening within the state. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the IEA wants to say, for each of these countries, we can tell you for sure that there's no undeclared nuclear activities happening. Since it's basically impossible to confirm an absence of evidence, they end up saying something like, there was no evidence of undeclared activities and all the material that we know about has been accounted for, things like that. So, yes, they're such a pain. They're so much smaller than PowerPoint. So safeguards are applied through basically a giant data integration activity. So states every year say, well, more frequently in some cases, but at least once a year say, here's the nuclear material that I have, here are the nuclear activities that are happening in my country. Depending on how much activity they have, they might have to declare much more frequently than that. And then the IEA takes that information and compares it to a whole suite of data that they collect, both in the field, when they're visiting those facilities, they're taking radiation measurements, they're taking physical samples of material that are sent back to the lab for destructive analysis. They're measuring walls to make sure the facility is actually, still operating as it was designed to operate and there's not hidden rooms. They're looking at and auditing operator bookkeeping to look at things like their shipping and receiving records. So they're collecting all this information in the field and bringing it together and trying to compare that to what the state has said. That's really the primary, like the gold standard for how safeguards are verified. But there's also this whole other part of information collection and analysis that's happening at IAEA headquarters, where they're collecting data about nuclear related trade items and also things in like heavy industry. So they can try to verify, like what are the capabilities of this state, even if we don't know that they're doing something. Do they have that technical latency to be able to flip a switch and just start doing other things at any moment? Yeah.
Does the IEA have to declare that they are like looking into a state's other various things, or can they just do that on the hush hush without the state knowing about it?
So they're very open about the fact that they collect this information, but they don't call out specific things at specific times.
Okay.
So, for example, there are publications that say like, we look at scientific and technical publications and here's how we use them and here's what we're doing. But they don't say like, hey, we're looking really closely right now, okay, because that could make some of those signatures less available. Okay. So they do things like look at trade data, they look at open source information. And so things like scientific publications, news media, social media, as well as geospatial data, so satellite imagery. The use case that we really focus on in our research, which we'll get to in a little bit here, is that open source information collection and analysis process. There are some really cool, unique challenges in that space that we'll discuss in just a little bit. So just to give you an idea of the scale of kind of operations of the IEA. So sometimes in the news, when we talk about IEA safeguards, it's touted in the news, it's like the UN's nuclear watchdog, and they sound really big and really tough. They're a bunch of accountants, basically, and that's not to dismiss their work. They do really amazing things, but it's a pretty small organization. So they've got, less than 900 staff here. Only about 400 of those are actually safeguard inspectors who are going out into the field. And their budget is 145 million euros per year, plus some additional contributions from states like the US and other wealthier states or countries with bigger nuclear programs. To give you a scale of what that budget means, because that can sound like a lot of money, 145 million euros is about the budget of the Vienna Police Department. But the IEA is in charge of like monitoring the entire world. They have less enforcement than the Vienna Police Department, but they have a much broader jurisdiction. So they're really doing a lot with not a lot of money. Yeah, please go ahead.
Just curious, what percent of the IAEA staff be in the US?
That's a good question. It's about, it has historically been up to like about 20 to 25%. Lately, it's been slightly smaller percentages because some of those positions are funded directly through the government rather than through the IEA's typical budget. That's where this plus 27 million comes in at the bottom, is through things like funding additional staff members. That has gone down in recent years, but I would say typically around 20% is average. They do have a mandate to have global representation in their staff, but they're also looking for a certain amount of expertise, which the US has quite a bit of. Good question. So just thinking about like the scale of this information that folks are dealing with. So the analyst team back at headquarters, they've got like 400 inspectors, a bunch of folks who are technicians who are making sure the high purity gamma, germanium detectors are working right, and monitoring software and building cameras. Of those staff, they've got, maybe 20 or so of these like open source type analysts who are looking at satellite imagery and open source data and trade information. Some of the types of data that they're dealing with. So in 2020, they acquired over 1,200 commercial satellite images. Those tend to be like the big company commercial satellites. As we start seeing these small satellites actually become like a little bit more useful with their high revisit rates, that number is probably going to grow. And they maintain 1,530 surveillance cameras at facilities. So these are cameras that are fixed, looking at things like a hatch over a reactor core. And they're just taking pictures at a given rate all the time. And each one of those pictures needs human eyeballs on it as part of their verification mandate. So that's just to give you kind of a scale of what the IEA was up to in 2020. There's one more number on here, which I really like, which is just crazy to see, because if we think about 1 year, and 2020 didn't even encompass like a full year of COVID, but a partial year of COVID, that inspectors spent over 2,300 days in quarantine, person days in quarantine. So that's a lot of quarantine time. But they were pretty insistent on, not missing verification activities just because of COVID. So those inspectors were still out and about quite a lot. So given the scale of all of this information that's coming in, especially visual data that's coming in, computer vision tasks have kind of gained some interest within both the R&D community internationally, as well as at the IEA, starting to think about like, okay, maybe we want some of these technologies and tools. Typically, the IEA is pretty conservative about things like adopting new technologies, because when they have a conclusion that they make from all of this data, the ramifications from that are international and pretty political. They're the ones that are kind of determining some of those states' fate. If they say that a country is developing nuclear weapons and they're not, that country is going to be ostracized. It's going to be a really big deal. So they want to be really sure. They're really conservative, but they're starting to show interest in some of these activities. And the one that's getting the most traction right now is safeguard surveillance review. So I mentioned the 1,300 or so cameras that are deployed around the world, all of which are getting human eyeballs on them. Oh, I'm going to move Nathaniel out of the way a little bit so you guys can actually.
Yeah, the far left thing.
Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you. So one of the activities that's getting the most traction is safeguard surveillance review. And this is actually an area where Sandia has been really involved. So when I say safeguard surveillance review, right, we've got these cameras looking down. What are our inspectors looking for? Well, they're looking for movement of key equipment. So it could be canisters of nuclear material. It could be cranes that are operating. It could be, any number of things that are indicating transfers of nuclear material, because that's kind of what their mandate is to verify. As well as things like anomaly detection, or things happening different in the facility that might indicate maybe they're not operating the way that they typically operate. So this picture kind of shows some R&D that's being done at Sandia to look at that anomaly detection, where instead of saying like, we are only interested in these white containers right here, and we want to find every white container every time it comes in, but then if they paint the container black, who knows if they can actually find it still. They're asking things like, what does the day-to-day life look like in a facility, and can we detect if it's different? So in this example, they actually trained a model where that container would go through on the dolly from left to right every time. So they, spent weeks just walking this container through, and then they switched the direction that they were moving. And the model actually recognized it right away. It's like, this is not normal activity. So that kind of gave initial indication to us that this might be something that we can look for. And there's new research going on now in terms of like, well, how small of differences can we actually detect with capabilities like this? So these are all research examples. Another potential application for computer vision for safeguards comes from satellite imagery analysis. So as I mentioned, as we get these small satellites going up with potentially very high revisit rates over nuclear facilities, where maybe we could monitor decommissioning activities or installation of big equipment, the frequency with which the IEA purchases satellite imagery might increase quite a bit. And so we're interested in things like detecting and counting, again, key pieces of equipment, indicators of patterns of life. So that could be vehicles, it could be steam coming out of a cooling tower, it could be indicators of construction, clearing forest areas, things like that. So those are some of the applications in satellite imagery that we're interested in. Another is for that open source monitoring. So when we're looking for open source indicators of nuclear material, there are certain pieces of equipment that we might be looking for, certain, maybe there's a poster in the background of an image of a nuclear facility that has safety information that an analyst might be able to get information from. Yeah, go ahead.
By open source, do you mean like something that anybody can see?
I mean something that is not classified information. So it might be
Okay.
behind a paywall that you have to just subscribe to a news subscription service, but something that anybody could potentially see if they're willing to make the investment for like those subscription services too. So just as an example, in open source, a few years ago, an article came out about a country and their new tractor facility. And this is a country that's kind of been in the news and people were kind of thinking they're up to something. So there was a picture of this foreign dignitary at this tractor facility that happened to be in an underground bunker. The equipment in this tractor facility was very specific and would have meant they were producing very, very nice tractors, which was unlikely. But taken within a nuclear context, which there were no like nuclear related words in this news article, that could be seen as like, wait a second, this is a piece of equipment that we're actually really interested in, gives us some clues about what they might be doing with their nuclear program. So this is why we can't just rely on things like text to be searching open sources. We also need to be thinking about how can we find indicators of the equipment that we're looking for just through pictures. Same thing happens with videos sometimes. There's a video that's not really supposed to be about research reactors. It's supposed to be about uranium mining. And 45 minutes into the video, there's like this shot of the pool from a research reactor. And we're like, oh, hey, that's actually really interesting. We wish we could find that without watching the whole video and waiting 45 minutes through, a French language video that we don't understand to be able to see this thing we're actually really interested in. And the last one that I just wanted to touch on, this is really cool research coming out of some of my colleagues in the European Commission. They have their own set of like equivalent of national laboratories. It's called the Joint Research Center that are distributed throughout the EU. So there are some folks in Italy who are working on indoor localization using computer vision. So if you imagine that you're a safeguards inspector and you're going to a nuclear facility that you've never been to before, maybe it's got kind of a complicated layout, you're jet lagged, they're taking you in circles all over the place and you can't remember where you've been or where you're going, but you need to make sure that you're in the right room to do a specific activity. They're looking at doing 3D imaging of a facility with a single walkthrough and then helping inspectors determine where they are by doing image matching. That can help inspectors figure out like, okay, I'm in this hallway and I'm facing this direction, so that they can better understand where they've been, where they're going, and are they in the right place. Okay, so hopefully by now I've convinced you computer vision is the solution for a bunch of different safeguards problems, but unfortunately it's never that easy, which is why R&D is super fun. So talking generally about computer vision, most computer vision models rely on deep learning and require a lot of labeled data. So for example, MNIST is a data set of handwritten digits that's used to help do like optical character recognition. That training data set has 70,000 handwritten digits, which I think were collected by the post office. I think those are all from zip codes. This is one of my favorites. It's Microsoft's Common Objects in Context or COCO data set. This data set is of common objects and actually has the objects really nicely outlined. So you can do image segmentation. There are over 200,000 images here with many more instances of objects because some of these images contain multiple different types of things, multiple dogs, many containers, a person and a horse, for example. And then ImageNet. ImageNet's kind of like the canonical one if you're doing computer vision for images. It's 14 million images. They're starting to label it in many different ways, but this is kind of meant for classification where you see one of these like, oh, that's a terrible resolution. I'm so sorry. You see kind of this like tightly framed picture of a thing, and then there's like one word label that goes with it, like dog, cat, spaghetti, all that fun stuff. So given that there are so many opportunity within safeguards to do computer vision, where's our nuclear equivalent of ImageNet, which I'm lovingly calling NukeNet, so that we can get started with all these projects. We're ready to go. Well, data for safeguards is really hard, and there's a few reasons why. First, safeguards relevant data is actually really scarce, and it's for a few different reasons. So it could be scarce because somebody proliferated and we had pictures of nuclear weapon stuff, and then it becomes like classified because we don't want to spread that information and make it available to give tips to future proliferators. It can also be commercially sensitive. Uranium enrichment companies don't really want pictures of certain parts of their facilities going up on the web because it gives away some proprietary commercial data. Also, there's few historical cases of countries developing nuclear weapons. If we think about the dozen or so historical cases, it's not that many when we're talking about the scale of data that we need to do meaningful computer vision. Also, future proliferators might not look exactly like historical proliferators. So we're bounded by, like physics. But at the same time, if we have a history of countries using centrifuges that are this tall and this wide, maybe the next developer of a uranium enrichment program is going to have taller, skinnier centrifuges or shorter, fatter centrifuges or slightly different materials that they're using. So we can't count on those historical cases, especially like the really old ones, like when the US developed nuclear weapons, to inform exactly what that's going to look like in the future. Just as an example of how scarce this data is, last year, over a period of about 6 months, we had 3 staff members who were searching for pictures of these containers. Anybody know what these containers are? Yes. So this is actually a fuel bank in Kazakhstan, where they're storing light enriched uranium. The IEA is storing light enriched uranium in case there's a disruption in fuel supply. So we are looking for pictures of this type of container. This is called a 30B container. So it's for low enriched uranium, up to 5%, U-235. We're also looking for one other kind of container. I'll show you pictures of those in a minute. So for 6 months, we're looking for 2 types of these uranium hexafluoride containers that are used to store and transport UF6 throughout the fuel cycle. These should be pretty common containers because the other type that we're interested in is for depleted and natural uranium. They're a bit bigger. So those are the ones that are coming from conversion facilities that would go into uranium enrichment. These would come out of uranium enrichment, go into fuel fabrication plants. So we thought these images are just going to be everywhere, right? This is like, we've got multiple steps of the fuel cycle represented. We had, a bunch of like 3 or 4 different staff members looking social media and open sources, looking even for images to purchase from editorial content, which is like what the Associated Press would use if they were going to release a news story about uranium hexafluoride and didn't have the right pictures. And we found a whopping 173 unique images, which is really not very many at all. And it was really expensive in terms of just paying for people's time to look for that very little amount of data. So this is actually the other type of container that we're interested in. There's 3 different designs, but they're all kind of these big 48-ton containers. We call them 48s. There's a few different designs. This one's called a 48G. It's got this little like belly button that you see here sticking out over the valve. So they only use it for storage because it would be likely to to break off or something during transportation, but we've got some transport style ones too. So the second challenge is that labeling data is really hard. So it's really boring. It's prone to error in part because it's really boring. It's also prone to expert disagreement. We love to set up rules for like what exactly constitutes a container and what it looks like and when it's a container and when it's not and how sure we have to be that it's a container. But when it gets right down to it, for an activity like this, we ask things like, at what point do these partially occluded 48G containers stop being containers? Like this one. Like, are we absolutely sure that that little sliver of a container is really a full 48G container? And also for some of these partially occluded ones, maybe it's a different style. Are we sure that it's not a 48Y container that can be shipped that's just stuck in there because they ran out of containers? So it gets to be really, really time consuming, really arduous, and not as clearly defined as you might think when you start this kind of project. And finally, one of the solutions to collecting all of this data yourself is to curate a really nice data set. This tends to be limited by the imaginations of the data curator. So this is an example from a data curation activity that we did maybe 2 or 3 years ago. We needed a bunch of pictures of this white container that's up on the crane for a computer vision project, actually for the one that I showed you earlier, where they're looking for changes in patterns of life. We took some snapshots, we installed these IEA surveillance cameras, and then spent just weeks putting this container up and down on the crane. So it's limited to the stager's imagination. I was the one writing out, here's all the things we're going to do with this white container, but maybe I missed some really relevant things. We never tried to turn it upside down, and maybe that's something that we would need to be able to recognize. It's limited to the environment. So in this case, we had 2 different cameras up, but we were just working in this one lab space. And so it was not, it's not easy to then transfer those models to get them to work well in a very different environment or to go to a different lab. It's limited by our photographic equipment. So we just had this one model of camera, and our techniques, we were just looking from above, just looking at certain lighting conditions, and also the diversity of the objects. So this container, we had, I think, about six of those containers. Some of them had holes punched in them so we could lower them and raise them from this pool more easily. Some of them didn't, but they were all in pretty good shape. None of them had huge dents or scratches. They looked pretty similar apart from those holes punched in the top. So we didn't have a lot of diversity. Just in addition to just how biased they may be, they're just really expensive and time consuming to generate. So with this example of the data set that we curated a couple years ago, we've got this one guy right here. Here's our crane operator. He's moving our container up and down, in and out of that pool all day long. In addition, here's his buddy. She is also a trained crane operator and is there as support for him in case he needs anything. They might have a 2-person rule when they're operating the crane. Their manager came out because he was like, hey, I heard the crane's operating today. Like, I'm going to go check it out. And then, of course, there's me. I'm here to make sure that he's not bugging the people that are operating the crane. So I'm there to answer all of his questions. So we've got 4 staff members for one container going up and down, which is really not terribly exciting, which gives you kind of an indication of just how intense this data curation process is. So the research that we've been doing the past couple of years has been looking at how we might use synthetic data to support computer vision tasks instead of having to curate all this real world data. We've been using a really unique validation process for that data that I'll tell you about, and then we'll get to the free research ideas. So just as a quick introduction to synthetic data. So when I say synthetic data, in this context, when we're talking about computer vision, I mean computer generated imagery or CGI. So that type of synthetic data is actually used in many different computer vision type projects. when the full scope of data that's needed can't be collected. And one example of that is with self-driving cars. So the folks who are developing the software for self-driving automobiles know that their cameras aren't going to be able to collect diverse enough images of what they need to be prepared to detect. So a lot of us have seen this example of like a stop sign with a sticker on it, and then all of a sudden the model can't recognize it as a stop sign anymore. That's really scary if you're thinking about getting in that car. If you're not in that car, other things that you want that model to be able to recognize are pedestrians who are crossing outside of crosswalks, cars that are going the wrong way in their traffic, different weather patterns, different lighting, different environments. You know, we don't just want models of downtown San Francisco. We also need areas that are more rural or agricultural, and in many, many different scenarios. So the self-driving car industry is using synthetic imagery like this in order to train their models to just be more diverse. It's also being used in agriculture because when we're talking about some of the agricultural applications are, for example, assessing crop damage. You don't really want to wait until crops get really, really damaged by pests in order to be able to recognize that something is going on. And so nobody wants to submit their farm to be the data collection opportunity. So they're using they're using synthetic data to augment their data sets to be able to characterize a number of different types of damage that can happen to foliage without actually exposing any plants to potential harm. So what are we doing in this area? So again, we're focusing on that open source monitoring use case, and we're developing synthetic data of the 30B, which is this type of container, and the 48, which is the bigger for natural and depleted uranium, to help develop models that can recognize these UF6 containers in the wild. We're developing them in this tool called Houdini. This is actually an artistic software tool that's used in Hollywood and in video games to make CGI that looks really realistic and can be easily altered. So within this platform, we can change things like the size of the container, how we're looking at it, how it's rotated. There's a wrapper package that we put on that helps us apply a number of different effects to these containers, like what material they appear to be made out of, if they're rusty or scratched. And then using the same Hollywood software, we're placing these containers in real 3D photographic environments. So these are high dynamic range panorama images. So these are from real cameras where we can use the data from those images to have, for example, a light source so that shadows are consistent, so that they're properly illuminated for that environment to get that really realistic effect. So we collected, I don't know, a few dozen of these high dynamic range 3D images from the web that look like places where you might find a UF6 container. And then we rendered them into 2D snapshots using a virtual photographer whose name is Lewis. These are all pictures of our synthetic containers in those real environments. So this is our 30B model. Here is a variety of our 48s. So here's the 48Y. This is the most common one used for transportation within the US domestic nuclear fuel cycle. This is that 48G for storage. And here's a 48X, which is a little bit smaller and has kind of a tapered skirt over here. That's also used for that natural and depleted uranium. So in addition to just singles, we can have many of them in rows together, lined up like you might see in a storage yard. So for me, one of the best things about this data is that in addition to just being prolific in its quantity, because we generated each one of these containers, they're also coming pre-labeled. So our software knows exactly where those are. So instead of, for me trying to make this perfect bounding box around my container, the software just puts those bounding boxes on for me. as well as other types of labeling, such as image segmentation, which is shown here, and other types of segmentation masks to support a wide variety of different computer vision applications, including things like distance imaging, like you would see in LiDAR. So, okay, so these are some like pretty pictures and they're fun to look at, but like, how can we know we can actually trust them and use them in our research? We're using a novel two-step validation process to make sure that these images actually are something that computer vision models can learn from, and then that those models can actually work on real world data, because we don't care if we can detect our own synthetic pictures. We want to be able to detect real pictures of US6 containers, so that next time there's a photo shoot in an underground tractor factory that's not actually producing tractors, we can say like, hey, that's a real picture, and we can see in here that we're detecting something that we're interested in from a safeguards perspective. So step one in our validation process is training multiple computer vision models. We train those models exclusively on our synthetic data, and then train them on our small set of those 170 something real world images, as well as about 500 distractor real world images that we have of things like propane tanks and paint cans and other kind of like cylindrical looking things. These models are not performing as well as models that were trained on real world data. That's kind of to be expected, but that's okay. We're training these models for an environment in which we might have only one example of a picture, or maybe even just like a physics model where we know that we can make something of certain dimensions and it'll work, and we want to be able to detect it, but we've never seen it before. So that's the environment that we're aiming for. We're using the real world images here, the 170 something, 73, to see if it works with our eyes on this distant environment in which we wouldn't have those 176 to actually know the true performance. So reduced performance is kind of our expectation here. We're training two classes of computer vision models. The first one is classification models. So classification models tell you kind of a list of words of things that are in a particular image. Those words come from labels that you train the model with, so it only can detect what you've trained it to do, as with any most models, as well as object detection models. So those are the ones with the bounding boxes that tell you where in an image the thing of interest is. So we're doing minimum 2 of each type of model so that we can be really sure that a diverse range of computer vision models could learn from our images. Step 2 is using explainability to figure out what the heck is going on in these models and why is our synthetic imagery either working or not working well. So we're looking at our false positives and true positives for evidence of what are models learning from our synthetic data, so that we can understand, for example, what kind of biases we're training into our model because of what's in this data, because it's a curated data set. Like, we are guilty of challenge number 3 here, so that we can observe kind of some of these biases and see what's going on, and then actually try to then train those biases out of the models. So we observe patterns, for example. So this is the original picture that was evaluated. We use these 4 different explainability techniques, and this was one that was classified as being a 30B uranium hexafluoride container. And there's all these indicators right around the paint can that make us think like, oh yeah, we didn't give any pictures of paint cans and say like, hey model, this is not the container that we're interested in. So what we do then is revise our synthetic data. So we evaluated a bunch of these results and saw a bunch of like cylindrical type things that were being classified as our containers, and they weren't our containers. There's a fair amount of acceptance of false positives within the open source world in terms of analysts being willing to look at a lot of garbage to be sure that they really got to the stuff that's relevant that might be hidden in there. But at some point we can't have them look at every single image, because in that case, like, why are you even using a model? So So we purchased some synthetic images, synthetic models that we could make into synthetic images of other cylindrical things like these oil processing equipment, propane tanks. Beer kegs are one that's like frequently misclassified on our model. So we bought a bunch of pictures of these things and are incorporating them right now into our data so that we can train models with these negative examples and then see, are we actually improving the performance of our data, and understand how that might influence how we're training future models where we don't have the same sort of testing environment to work in. So our data set's still in progress. We've got about 300,000 or so images right now with all the metadata that I described, but we'll have over 1 million by the end of September. Bless you. We're going to be hosting our data set, but are not quite yet there, on Lawrence Berkeley's Berkeley Data Cloud, which is a place where we hope nuclear related data for a number of different projects might end up. We're hoping that it kind of turns into a platform for all things non-proliferation data science. And then we have a nice API for users to help navigate it. And then this image here is of our documentation, which is actually currently accessible from Read the Docs, that we hope can kind of give people an introduction to our data set and figure out how they might want to use it, what's actually in there, how to navigate it. So we hope that our initial 200,000 or so will be made public very soon. We're just waiting final approvals for that, but certainly by the end of September, we'll have the full 1 million data, full 1 million images out and ready for consumption. So here are some research ideas. As we've been working through this project, we kind of come up with these questions over and over. So when we're out giving talks like this, someone will say like, well, hey, how realistic do your images actually have to be in order to be useful? And we'll be like, that is a great question. We don't know, but that's why we're making this data. So you can go and ask those questions. So we'll have probably even a more complete list of research questions available for folks when we publish the data. But these are just some examples that we wanted to give you to kind of get you started thinking. If you've got a research project that you're imagining coming up next year, and you want to start preparing for it or thinking about how you might use some of these images of our UF6 containers, as well as now things like propane tanks and oil tankers and all kinds of military containers. You can think about what sort of projects you might be interested in that can use this data and hopefully will make proliferation detection easier for everyone and thereby save the world in the process. So again, our images are coming September 2022 on Berkeley Data Cloud. If you're my required caveat at the end is that this research was funded by the NNSA, the non-proliferation, Defense Nuclear Non-Proliferation R&D data science portfolio. They've been really generous with us the past couple of years. And that's it. Any questions?
Sorry.
So like theoretically you could get, it wouldn't have to be like a cylindrical storage unit. You could do anything really, like any type of equipment. You just have to program in those 3D images.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so this data set is kind of being produced, part research and part operational. Like the research part is like, what do we actually have to do to get this to work, and how can we do this validation process? But thinking for the future, like if you're not interested in uranium hexafluoride, you're interested in centrifuges or specific valves or whatever it may be. Those capabilities exist to produce different types of equipment. It would just be a matter of actually then like making those images, and hopefully we'll be able to have a defensible conclusion after all of this. It says like this is how we know that the data rendering process is legitimate and useful.
Thanks.
are all of these are just 1D images that are like a single image of one thing from one angle? Is there any work doing on like, oh, if you take it from this angle and from this angle, like in a real world situation with someone going around, you might catch the same thing in like 3 different images from different positions. Is there any work going into that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. That is actually the next data set that we're going to produce.
Okay.
So, you know, in the data that we've produced so far, we kind of have these parameters around Lewis, our photographer, with like how low to the ground he's getting, or if he can stand on something and how close he might get to an object to take its picture. Our next one is to kind of program him to very serially like go through many different angles and positions so that we're getting like a really comprehensive picture of like the one item in the one environment.
Okay. Because yeah, I mean, even like modern cell phones that have the planoptic cameras, just so you can take one image but get multiple different focuses on it and stuff like that. I'm assuming that kind of rolls in with that as well.
Yeah, that it's great. And that really kind of leads into one of the research areas that we want to look into in the future, which is like, you know, we're putting these containers in all these different environments. One of the next steps that we also need to do is think about putting them into virtual environments so we can expand our environment selection even more. One of the things we'd really like to think about in the future is like, well, what if we don't want to develop environments? What if we just want to develop a model that doesn't care about the environment? Some of our research from 2 years ago that was before this project was an internally funded 1-year effort indicated that environment's actually like much more important than we had anticipated. And so thinking about, well, how can we develop like new architectures for these models so that they don't care about environments, because we want to see those containers if they're, you know, in environments where we would expect them, but also if they're in a grocery store or on the side of a road because they fell off a truck, or, you know, all these different environments that we don't necessarily have that training data for. We want to still be able to detect. And so how can we get out of the process of saying, let's model every single potential environment like the auto industry is doing, and say, we want to always be able to detect, you know, this thing.
Hmm. And with biases, like I know computer imaging has, like when you're imaging people, it has a lot of problems with, you know, imaging people with different skin colors and stuff like that. Are there biases, like, I don't know, maybe cultural biases that might not be like one country it stores their stuff differently versus another country, and that might cause it to set off alarms that aren't actually alarms?
What about like snow? There's snow on all the containers.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So environmental factors, certainly. Safety standards, like in the United States, we would never stack 30B containers on top of each other because of a criticality concern. If you're doing enrichment on the cheap and just need to get stuff done fast, maybe you don't care as much. And so there, you know, we've also thought about things like, you know, we always see these containers lying horizontally. Why are we assuming that nobody ever just tips them on their side? The way that the models work with the processing the data is getting rotated, so it should be able to recognize containers that are turned for 90 degrees, for example. But if we go back to this white container, which is my favorite little container over there. So some colleagues of ours at Brookhaven trained a model to detect a container that was very similar to this, and sent us their code and said, like, do your worst. And we turned the model 90 degrees when we were carrying it on a dolly, and all of a sudden it couldn't recognize the container. So that's something that should happen in the computer vision model, but for whatever reason in this case, it was just kind of breaking things. And so even just thinking about like, well, do you use a dolly or a crane when you're moving things around can make a difference in how the models are going to be reacting. So we have a lot of assumptions that go into it that we need to be really aware of.
So on something like this that's trained on like what is normal movement for this container, would it like, is there a way to like get around someone, you know, carrying it them in front of the dolly and walking backwards versus them with the dolly in front of them pushing it, kind of thing. I mean, that's probably something that could just be solved by someone looking at it, but it would still probably throw a wrench somewhere, right?
Yeah, and we need to figure out like what differences actually matter, right? So like if we're looking broadly at patterns of life, it may mean that I go to lunch at 12:30 every day. If I go to lunch at 11:30 one day, that's probably not safeguard significant, right? It could mean that there's a difference in operations. It could also mean that my mom's visiting and so I'm leaving early and so I went to lunch early. So being able to kind of fine tune some of that anomaly detection, especially if we could have it be like, well, we don't really care if there's anomalies like in that part of the room, because maybe there's going to be a staff party or maybe that's just an office space, but we do really care if there's anomalies like around the pool or around the crane. We're starting to think about like how to combine like the object detection to say, here's the crane, we care about the crane, and we only want to care about anomalies that are happening near the crane. We don't care about anomalies that are happening in the staff kitchen or whatever.
So how universal are these storage containers? Like, would we, I don't know, when they standardize things, like, so like, so it's had something, could have had something different, the Chinese. So,
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really good question. These are containers that are used really widely in the US nuclear industry. Out of convenience, they tend to be used a lot of other places if material is going to interact with the US nuclear fuel cycle, then it's just easier for them to put it within our regulated containers. I doubt that people would use, well, again, and this is an assumption, right? Like it would be very surprising to me if people used those containers for something that wasn't uranium hexafluoride because they're so tightly regulated that they're really expensive.
yeah, but I'm just wondering if like, you'll need a different data set for, say, the Indian fuel cycle.
Yeah, it's quite possible. I mean, yeah, these particular uranium hexafluoride containers are pretty broadly in use, but that's not to say it's the only container that can be attached to the valves at those facilities that they might use for any number of other purposes, or if they have, domestic stuff that they're not going to export, they use something else. I'm not an expert on like what other containers folks might use and like the regulations around that, but I can tell you like we make a lot of assumptions in the US about what nuclear fuel assemblies look like for pressurized water reactors, right? Like you've got that nice little square grid, but the Russians' designs are hexagons. And so, so there is like a certain amount of awareness that you'd have to be able to broadly detect that stuff. What that would mean was that you just need to then develop a model of the hexagonal fuel assembly and integrate that into your model.
And what about non-visual? Like you could attach just a little radiation detector on there as well, or like a radiation imager. It probably cost prohibitive, but would save on a lot of these false negative, positive kind of things.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point. The open source information typically isn't the only piece of information that's going into making an assessment. So for example, when we talked about this research, we were scoring through open source media and looking for pictures of these hyperbolic cooling towers. This one shows it's cloudy, but man, it could like almost look like a steam plume, right? And then like the one on the right is like, oh yeah, that plant is like definitely operating. These are never like the smoking gun. So we had pictures, for example, we did a test where we geolocated our US based images and then compared it to NRC like daily reactor operations data. but there were pictures that were like, dated from 5 years ago, but they were a picture of like a reactor operating in 1976. Like somebody went into like the display hall at a reactor and was like, oh, look, that's what this place looked like in 1976, and took a picture, and then it was dated as, a couple of weeks ago when it was really like 50-year-old picture or whatever. So they weren't, it's not a 100% indicator, but things like open source data can lead the IEA to ask questions and perform follow-up actions. So, nobody would ever get their hands slapped and be like, you are absolutely proliferating because we found this thing in open source media. It would probably be more something like, hey, we see that you're publishing a lot about uranium, but your declaration doesn't say that you're using uranium at this university. Can you help clarify? And that usually ends in something like the nuclear regulator would be like, I'm so sorry, we forgot to declare that. We didn't even know they were doing it. And then there was like some internal stuff happening in that country to be like, hey, you guys, you really need to tell us so we can tell the IEA. And then everything kind of gets smoothed out. In some cases, like additional information is requested. So for example, I was an analyst for 2 years, and I was really early in my career. So I was not working on any of the countries that you see in the newspaper. I was working on countries like Tuvalu, who don't have really like scary proliferation prospects coming up anytime soon, unless things have changed since I've been there. And so, so most of the time I wasn't like finding like the gotcha thing. There was one time when I did see something in open sources where there was this country, they were developing like an on-site dry storage for spent fuel. And they were kind of boasting about the capacity of their pad that was out back. It was supposed to be like a 3-phase operation, but they're like, oh yeah, we can take this much fuel right away, we're ready, which is actually different than what their declaration was. So that resulted in like a letter of clarification, like this very diplomatic process where, some person way above my pay grade at the IEA wrote a nicely worded letter that was like, can you please tell us what's actually the status of your dry fuel pad? Because we have indications that it might be higher than you said. And then they were like, oh, actually, we were just kind of boasting because our neighbors already have theirs ready and we want, it'll be ready any day now. And we're like, but your declaration says that's in 5 years. And they're like, yeah, any day. So then you kind of like, it's this back and forth kind of clarification. But open source information can lead to states having to append their declaration, could lead to a request for an on-site visit to collect more data. In the past, there have been indicators that maybe like historically states haven't declared their full program and have since stopped things. And then there's some, like a lot of negotiation back and forth about like, hey, you guys, what was going on back then? But it's usually used, as that like augmentation to support other safeguard measures. Sometimes it can even indicate things like, hey, you might want to take this type of sample in this location to influence some on-site stuff. Overhead imagery is really cool in that it can indicate to inspectors like where they should be headed and what they should see en route. So for example, if they're taken really the long way around and we can see from satellite imagery that's not the main road through, like that can lead to questions about can we go over there, what's happening over there, why aren't we taking the route that the staff typically take.
Is social media also stuff like, I've heard lots of stories of, you can track Russian troop movements through Tinder kind of thing. Like, and like I have heard a story back when Google Earth was new, bored people would just upload pictures of like, oh, I'm working at they didn't even know what they were working at. They're guarding a place and they take a picture of it and they upload it, and it's security. I imagine that's a really rich, I don't really have a question, but it seems like a very rich place as more and more people have cameras and stuff like that to find images of things like this.
It is.
Yeah, or like when the people on the internet got Russia to bomb ISIS because of some photos that ISIS took, and they were able to locate their base. because, oh, well, there's this power plant nearby.
Yeah,
And they're all looking just by that.
it's a fantastic point. I mean, so the open source work that the IEA is doing starts to kind of look like intelligence work, but they do have to take that clear line of like, they're really only looking at stuff that would be publicly available, right? So they don't have fake accounts where they're friends with all the guys in ISIS. But for example, like some more developing countries do a lot of stuff on Facebook. There are nuclear regulators who use Facebook more than their webpage to talk about what's going on a daily basis. And so that is a really rich source of information. I felt really old the other day because I was looking for something on a university webpage and could not find any information about it. And I emailed, the head of whatever and asked for more information. And they were like, it's on our Twitter and LinkedIn. Like, how are you not seeing this? And I was like, oh, geez, went to your website. How ridiculous of me. And so, so it is a really rich source of information. And there's been like documented cases of stuff being published on social media that the agency was able to use, like even more so than their typical like traditional websites.
Cool.
Yeah, so you should all go into safeguards. It's a really fun field. It's not all this. I mean, this is pretty data sciencey. There's, the domain itself is just really diverse. So in our department, which is the International Safeguards and Engagements Department at Sandia, we've got political scientists, that's me, a psychologist, that's Jesse, who you talked to last week. You might not think he's a psychologist when you talk to him. We've got electrical engineers, nuclear engineers, geologists, geographers. It's so diverse, and there's room for everybody to play with these different perspectives. So that's one of the things that I really, really like about being in safeguards, is just the opportunity to talk to all different kinds of people, use different skills, different perspectives to come in, and I'll try to solve the same problem together, because there is not like anyone that I know that could just solve a safeguards problem on their own because of, whatever fancy degree they have or their background. Like, it's always teams working together, combining their expertise in really unique ways to solve these problems. So that's my sales pitch for safeguards.
Cool. One more time. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, everybody online for attending. We will post the video of this, and can we share your slides too? Great. And